The secret life of the world's richest people. He has $130 billion in his bank account. This morning, he clipped coupons. Let that sit with you for a second. $130 billion. That is more money than the entire GDP of most countries on this planet. That is enough money to end hunger in multiple nations, to build cities from scratch, to rewrite the future of entire generations. And this man, this one individual, woke up this morning, sat at his kitchen table in a house that most middle-class families would consider unremarkable, and clipped coupons. Not because he had to, but because, in his mind, that is simply what you do. You do not waste money. You do not perform wealth. You protect it. You guard it like it is the last warm thing left in a very cold world. And that choice, that single, quiet, almost invisible choice, tells you more about the psychology of extreme wealth than any Forbes profile ever could. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. Close your eyes for just a moment and imagine, genuinely imagine, that you woke up tomorrow and every financial problem you had ever faced was gone. Every bill, every debt, every sleepless night staring at a bank balance that never seemed to move. Gone. What would you do? Would you move? Would you travel? Would you buy the car, the house, the life you always told yourself you deserved? Most of us, if we are being honest, would say yes. Of course we would. Because we have been conditioned, from the time we were old enough to understand money, to believe that wealth equals display. That success is something you are supposed to show. That if you have made it, the world should be able to see it. But what if that belief, the one most of us carry so deeply we have never even questioned it, is completely and utterly wrong? What if everything you thought you knew about being rich was built on a lie? What if the people with more money than entire countries chose, deliberately and consciously, to live like they had almost nothing? And what if the ones flashing gold watches, private jets, and $100 million yachts were not the winners of this story, but the cautionary tales? What if the loudest rooms were hiding the emptiest vaults? Tonight, we go inside both worlds. We go inside the quiet, almost invisible lives of the billionaires who chose to live like ordinary people. And we go inside the blinding, breathtaking excess of the ones who could not stop spending, could not stop performing. Could not stop chasing a version of themselves that the money was supposed to create, but never quite did. And by the end of this video, I promise you this. You will not just see billionaires differently. You will see money itself differently. You will see your own relationship with money differently. Stay with me. Because the story that unfolds over the next hour, the real story, the one the headlines never told, is one that nobody saw coming. Not the journalists, not the financial analysts, not even, in some cases, the billionaires themselves. Before we go any deeper into this story, we would love to know, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you are new here and you want to make sure you never miss a story like this one, hit that subscribe button right now, because what is coming next in this video is something you are going to want to tell people about. Now, before we get into the names, the numbers, and the stories that are going to make you question everything you have ever been told about wealth, I need you to do something for me. I need you to set aside everything you think you already know. Every assumption, every image that comes to mind when you hear the word billionaire, every movie, every magazine cover, every Instagram post that has ever shaped the picture in your head of what it looks like to have more money than you could spend in 1,000 lifetimes. Set all of that aside, because the truth, the actual, documented, verified truth about how the world's wealthiest people really live, is so far from that picture that, by the time we are done tonight, you are going to wonder how you ever believed it in the first place. There are 3 questions at the heart of this story. 3 questions that researchers, psychologists, financial historians, and investigative journalists have spent decades trying to answer. And tonight, we are going to answer all 3 of them. Not with bullet points, not with statistics pulled from a spreadsheet, but with the real human stories behind the money. Stories of men and women who had everything the world told them to want, and then made choices that stunned everyone around them. So here are the 3 questions. First, why would a man worth $130 billion drive a 10-year-old car, live in the same modest house he bought in 1958, and eat breakfast at McDonald's almost every single morning of his adult life? Not because he cannot afford better, not because he does not know better, but because, according to every person who has ever spent real time with him, he genuinely does not want better. Why? What does a person go through? What do they see? What do they feel? What do they survive that rewires their entire relationship with money to that degree? Because this is not just one man. This pattern shows up again and again among the world's wealthiest people, and the reason behind it is far more emotionally complex than most people ever stop to consider. Second question. Why do some of the flashiest, most publicly extravagant billionaires in modern history end up not just broke, but in courtrooms, in handcuffs, or quietly erased from the conversation entirely? Why does the performance of wealth, the yachts, the gold interiors, the magazine covers, the public declarations of being the next greatest person alive, so consistently end in collapse? Is it simply bad financial decisions? Is it arrogance? Or is there something deeper happening underneath all of that display? Something psychological, something almost predictable in hindsight, that the people closest to these individuals could see building for years before everything fell apart? Because when you look closely at the stories we are going to examine tonight, the warning signs were there. They were always there. And that is one of the most uncomfortable parts of this entire story. And the third question, the one that I think is the most important of all, and the one that I personally could not stop thinking about long after I finished researching this video. What does the way a billionaire chooses to spend, or not spend, their money secretly reveal about who they really are as a human being? Not as a businessman, not as an investor, not as a brand or a public figure or a Forbes ranking, but as a person. As someone who was once a child with fears and dreams and wounds that never fully healed, regardless of how many zeros eventually appeared next to their name. Because here is what I found after going through every single story in this video. The money itself is almost never the real story. The money is just the mirror. And what it reflects back is something far more raw, far more human, and far more universal than any of us might be comfortable admitting. We are going to answer all three of those questions tonight. And we are going to do it through the lives of real people. People whose names you know, whose companies you have probably used, whose faces have appeared on screens and covers and courtroom sketches across the last several decades. Warren Buffett, Ingvar Kamprad, Chuck Feeney, Ika Batista, Elizabeth Holmes, Carl Robitor, Hetty Green. Each of them a billionaire. Each of them a completely different answer to the same impossible question. What do you do when you have everything? Some of them found peace. Some of them found destruction. Some of them found something so unexpected, so quietly radical, that the financial world is still processing it decades later. And one of them, made a decision so extraordinary, so completely against every instinct that wealth is supposed to create, that when the truth finally came out, it stopped people cold. We are going to get to all of it. But we start where every great story starts, at the beginning, with a boy, a Depression-era street in the American Midwest, and a lesson about money that would go on to shape the most successful investment career in the history of the modern world. His name is Warren Edward Buffett. And if you want to understand why one of the richest human beings who has ever walked this earth chooses to live the way he does, you cannot start with the billions. You cannot start with Berkshire Hathaway, or the shareholder letters, or the decades of investment returns that made financial analysts around the world feel like they were watching something closer to magic than mathematics. You have to start in 1930. You have to start in Omaha, Nebraska, in the middle of the most catastrophic economic collapse the United States had ever experienced. You have to start with a 6-year-old boy watching the world around him come apart at the seams and understanding, in the wordless way that children understand things that adults cannot yet articulate, that money is not just a convenience. Money is survival. Money is the difference between the family that keeps their house and the family that loses everything overnight. That lesson, absorbed not in a classroom, not from a book, but from the lived reality of an entire nation falling to its knees, never left Warren Buffett. Not when he made his first million, not when he made his first billion, not when the number next to his name became so large that it lost all practical meaning. The boy who watched the Depression reshape everything around him never fully left the man who would one day be worth more than most countries on this planet. Warren Buffett bought his first stock at the age of 11. He filed his first tax return at 13, deducting his bicycle as a business expense because he used it to deliver newspapers on his paper route. By the time he was a teenager, he had already purchased 40 acres of farmland in Nebraska using money he had saved and earned himself. He was not playing at business. He was not performing ambition for the approval of adults around him. He was building something, quietly and methodically, the way a person builds something when they are genuinely afraid of what happens if they stop. And that fear, that quiet, ever-present awareness of how quickly security can disappear, became the engine of everything that followed. When Buffett eventually studied under the legendary economist Benjamin Graham at Columbia University, he did not just learn investment theory. He found a framework that matched the emotional architecture he had been carrying since childhood. Value investing, the discipline of finding things that are worth more than the world currently believes they are worth, and then waiting, patiently and without panic, for the world to catch up, was not just a financial strategy for Warren Buffett. It was a philosophy of life. It was the belief that underneath all the noise and performance and short-term thinking that drives most human behavior, there is a quieter, slower, more enduring truth. And that truth, if you are disciplined enough to find it and patient enough to hold on to it, will always win in the end. In 1958, Warren Buffett purchased a 5-bedroom house in Omaha, Nebraska for $31,500. He still lives there today. The house sits in a quiet, ordinary neighborhood. It has no gate, no security wall visible from the street, no architectural statement of any kind. It is, by every external measure, the home of a comfortable but unremarkable American family. And that is, in many ways, exactly the point. Because while the address has never changed, the bank account attached to the man inside that house has grown from $31,000 to, at various points, more than $130 billion. The house did not change because Buffett did not change. And Buffett did not change because, according to everyone who knows him well, he never needed the house to tell the world who he was. He already knew who he was. And that certainty, that deep, unshakable sense of identity that exists completely independently of any external display, is, according to psychologists who study extreme wealth, one of the rarest qualities a billionaire can possess. Most people, when they acquire significant wealth, feel an almost irresistible pressure to update their surroundings to match their new status. The bigger house, the better car, the upgraded everything. It is not greed, necessarily. It is human nature. It is the desire to have the outside world reflect what has changed on the inside. But Buffett never felt that pressure. Or if he did, he never gave in to it. And the result is one of the most quietly extraordinary lives in the history of American wealth. He drives himself to work. He stops at McDonald's most mornings for breakfast, choosing from a small selection of items depending on how the market is performing that day. His wife revealed that on days when the market is down, he orders the cheaper option. He drinks 5 cans of Coca-Cola a day. He watches television. He plays bridge online. He reads, voraciously and constantly, are spending the majority of every working day consuming information rather than attending meetings or performing the rituals of corporate leadership that most CEOs of major companies consider non-negotiable. And he gives. He gives on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. In 2006, Warren Buffett announced that he would donate the vast majority of his fortune to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, along with several family foundations. It was, at the time, the largest charitable donation in American history. And he did it not with a press conference designed to burnish his image, but with a matter-of-fact letter that read more like a man updating his will than a man making a historic gesture. Because to Buffett, it was not a gesture. No, it was simply the logical conclusion of a philosophy he had held his entire life, that the money was never really his to begin with. It was always just passing through. Now, Warren Buffett is extraordinary. But he is not alone, because on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, in a country known more for its flat-pack furniture and its long winter nights than for producing billionaires, another man was building another empire. and making almost identical choices about how to live inside it. His name was Ingvar Kamprad. And if you have ever assembled a bookshelf with a tiny Allen key and a sheet of instructions that seemed specifically designed to test your patience, then Ingvar Kamprad's decisions have touched your life directly, because Ingvar Kamprad founded IKEA. And IKEA, as of the time of this recording, is one of the most recognizable retail brands on the face of the earth, with hundreds of stores across dozens of countries and annual revenues that place it comfortably among the most successful companies in modern commercial history. Ingvar Kamprad, at the height of his wealth, was worth somewhere between $30 and $60 billion, depending on which estimate you trust and how you account for the complex series of foundations and holding structures through which IKEA's ownership was arranged. By any measure, he was one of the wealthiest human beings alive. And he flew economy class. Every time. Without exception. This was not a publicity stunt. This was not a carefully managed piece of brand mythology designed to make IKEA seem more relatable to its working and middle-class customer base. Our employees who traveled with Kamprad on business confirmed it repeatedly and consistently. The man who owned one of the world's great retail empires sat in economy class, accepted the same bag of pretzels as everyone else, and thought nothing of it. He drove old cars. He bought his clothes at flea markets and second-hand shops. He was known to visit his local market near closing time, when vendors were discounting their remaining produce to avoid throwing it away, and he would buy his vegetables there rather than paying full price at a proper grocery store. His employees, many of whom were aware of exactly how much their employer was worth, sometimes found themselves in the surreal position of watching a man with tens of billions of dollars argue, cheerfully and without any apparent self-consciousness, over the price of a tomato. And Kamprad saw nothing strange about this whatsoever, because to him, waste was the enemy. Not poverty, not scarcity, waste, the unnecessary spending of resources that did not need to be spent. It was a value he had absorbed growing up on a farm in rural Sweden, in a family that did not have much and therefore treated everything they had with a kind of quiet reverence that never left him, no matter how large the numbers on his financial statements eventually became. Kamprad was born in 1926 in Småland, a region of Sweden historically associated with hard work, self-reliance, and a deep cultural suspicion of excess. He started his first business as a child, buying matches in bulk and reselling them to neighbors at a small profit. He founded IKEA in 1943 when he was 17 years old, initially selling pens, wallets, and picture frames by mail order. The furniture came later, and with it, a revolution in the way ordinary people around the world thought about their homes. But through all of it, through the decades of growth, the expansion into new markets, the transformation of a small Swedish mail order business into a global phenomenon, Kamprad held on to the values of his childhood with a grip that neither success nor wealth could loosen. He believed, genuinely and completely, that a leader who lived extravagantly sent a message to their organization that extravagance was acceptable. And extravagance, in Kamprad's worldview, was not acceptable. It was a form of disrespect. To the customers who trusted IKEA to keep its prices low, to the employees who worked hard for wages that were never going to make them rich, and to the resources of a planet that he believed deserved to be treated with more care than the culture of modern consumption typically offered. Ingvar Kamprad passed away in January 2018 at the age of 91 in his home in Sweden. He was, by most accounts, at peace. He had built something that would outlast him by generations, and he had done it without ever once feeling the need to prove to the world that he was the man who built it. But of all the stories of billionaire frugality that exist in the modern era, there is one that stands above all the others. One that makes Warren Buffett's modest house and Ingvar Kamprad's economy class seat look, by comparison, almost conventional. One that, when I first encountered it during the research for this video, I genuinely stopped me in my tracks and made me sit quietly for several minutes, just thinking about what it meant. The man's name is Chuck Feeney, and Chuck Feeney did something that no billionaire in the history of recorded wealth had ever done before, and that very few have done since. He gave it all away. Not eventually. Not after his death, through a carefully structured estate plan designed to minimize taxes while maximizing legacy. He gave it all away while he was still alive, deliberately and systematically, over the course of several decades. And he did it in complete secret. For years, nobody outside of a very small circle of trusted associates knew what Chuck Feeney had done. And the reason that story matters so much, and the reason we are going to spend a significant amount of time on it later in this video, is that it forces a question that most of us are not entirely comfortable sitting with. If you had $8 billion and you gave every single dollar of it away, and you went back to living in a rented apartment and flying economy class and carrying your papers around in a plastic shopping bag, would you feel like you had lost something? Or would you feel, as Chuck Feeney has said in the rare interviews he's given over the years, like you had finally found something? We are going to come back to Chuck, because his story has an ending that I genuinely believe is one of the most remarkable endings in the history of American wealth. But before we get there, we need to cross to the other side of the story. We need to meet the billionaires who made a completely different choice. The ones who looked at everything they had built and decided that the world needed to see it. All of it. Loudly, visibly, and without apology. And we need to understand not just what they did, but why. Because the why, as we are about to discover, is far more complicated and far more human than it might first appear. There is a photograph that circulated widely in the financial press in the early 2000s. In it, a man stands on the deck of a luxury yacht somewhere off the coast of Brazil, arms spread wide, chin lifted, the kind of posture that says, without words, without apology, without any apparent awareness of how it might look to anyone watching, that this moment, this life, this extraordinary accumulation of everything the world has to offer belongs entirely and completely to him. And the man in that photograph is Ike Batista. And in the year that photograph was taken, he was the 8th richest person on Earth, with a personal fortune estimated at $34 billion. He was also, though nobody outside his closest circle fully understood it yet, standing at the very edge of one of the most dramatic financial collapses in modern history. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because to understand what happened to Ike Batista, to truly understand it, not just as a financial story, but as a human one, you have to go back to where he started. You have to go back to a boy growing up in the shadow of one of the most powerful men in Brazilian industry. A boy who was given every advantage, every opportunity, every door that wealth and connection could open, and who spent the rest of his life trying to prove that he deserved to walk through them. Ike Batista was born in 1956 in Minas Gerais, Brazil, the son of Eliezer Batista, who would go on to become one of the most influential figures in the Brazilian mining industry, serving multiple times as Minister of Mines and Energy, and playing a central role in the development of Vale, which became one of the largest mining companies in the world. Growing up as the son of a man like that is, by any measure, a complicated inheritance. On one hand, you have access, education, connections, and a template for success that most people spend their entire lives trying to construct from scratch. On the other hand, you spend your childhood and your adolescence and, if you are not careful, all your entire adult life in the psychological shadow of someone whose achievements the world considers exceptional. And for Ike Batista, according to people who knew him well during his rise, that shadow never fully lifted. No matter how large his own empire grew, no matter how many companies he launched or how many billions accumulated next to his name, there was always the sense, from those closest to him, that he was building not just for himself, but against something. Against the whisper, real or imagined, that he was merely the son of a great man rather than a great man himself. He dropped out of university and moved to Canada in his early 20s, working in gold trading and beginning to develop the instincts for resource extraction that would eventually become the foundation of his fortune. He returned to Brazil and began building, or systematically and ambitiously, a conglomerate of companies across the oil, gas, mining, logistics, and energy sectors. He named this conglomerate the EBX Group, and at its peak it encompassed companies with a combined market value of tens of billions of dollars. He became, in the eyes of the Brazilian public and the international financial press, a symbol of Brazil's emergence as a global economic power. He was charming, photogenic, media-savvy in a way that few businessmen of his generation were, and he understood intuitively that, in the modern era, the story of a company and the story of its founder are not separate things. They are the same thing. And so he told his story loudly, constantly, and with a level of personal confidence that most people found either deeply inspiring or faintly unsettling, or depending on how closely they were paying attention to the details behind the headline numbers. He owned a mansion in the Rio de Janeiro neighborhood of Barra da Tijuca that was described by visitors as more closely resembling a luxury hotel than a private home. He had a speedboat racing team. He owned a modeling agency. He gave interviews in which he spoke about his wealth not with the careful, measured humility that financial advisors typically counsel their ultra-high net worth clients to project, but with a directness that bordered on proclamation. He told reporters that he intended to become the richest man in the world by 2015. He made public statements suggesting that poverty was, at its root, only a consequence of insufficient ambition. A comment that generated significant controversy in a country where millions of people lived in conditions that had nothing to do with their ambition and everything to do with systems of inequality that had been in place for generations. And through all of it, the markets watched, and the investors followed, and the money kept flowing in, because when a man projects that level of certainty about his own destiny, it is very difficult for the people around him to hold on to their doubts. Until, of course, the moment when doubt is all that is left. The collapse began in 2012 and accelerated with a speed that left the financial world genuinely struggling to process what it was witnessing. And the oil reserves that Batista's company OGX had projected with such confidence turned out to be far smaller than estimated. Production targets were missed, then missed again, then abandoned entirely. Investor confidence, which had been the primary fuel keeping the entire EBX structure aloft, began to evaporate. And once it began, it did not stop. Within 18 months of the peak of his fortune, Ike Batista had lost $34 billion. The entire amount. Gone. The companies that had been valued by the markets at tens of billions were, in several cases, worth essentially nothing. The mansion, the yacht, the speedboat team, the modeling agency, all of it became entangled in the financial and legal chaos that followed. Brazilian authorities eventually charged Batista with a range of offenses, including market manipulation and bribery, allegations that he has contested through legal proceedings that, according to reports at the time of this recording, have continued for years. The man who had stood on the deck of that yacht with his arms spread wide, declaring himself the future richest person on earth, had become one of the most dramatic cautionary tales in the history of modern finance. And perhaps the most haunting part of the entire story is this: almost nobody who had watched him closely during the years of his ascent claimed to be entirely surprised. The warning signs, they said, had been visible for a long time. The certainty had always been a little too absolute. The projections had always been a little too optimistic. The performance had always been, in some hard-to-articulate way, slightly more important to him than the underlying reality it was supposed to represent. But if Ike Batista's story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of performing wealth on a grand scale, then the story of Elizabeth Holmes is something even more unsettling. Because Elizabeth Holmes did not inherit a platform. She did not grow up in the shadow of a powerful father whose achievements she spent her life trying to surpass. She built her platform from nothing, using nothing but intelligence, charisma, an extraordinary capacity for projecting certainty, and a vision that, had it been real, would genuinely have changed the world. The tragedy of Elizabeth Holmes, and it is a tragedy, whatever one thinks of the choices she made and the consequences they produced, is that the vision itself was not entirely wrong. The idea that a single drop of blood, analyzed by a small and affordable device, could provide accurate results for hundreds of different medical tests simultaneously was not a foolish idea. It was a genuinely revolutionary one. The problem was not the dream. The problem was what happened when the dream collided with reality, and Holmes, according to federal prosecutors and the jury that eventually heard the evidence, chose to hide that collision rather than acknowledge it. Elizabeth Holmes grew up in Washington, D.C., in a family with deep roots in public service and a strong culture of ambition and achievement. She enrolled at Stanford University to study chemical engineering and dropped out in 2003, or at the age of 19, to found a company she would call Theranos, a name she constructed from the words therapy and diagnosis. She had, from the very beginning, an unusual gift for inspiring confidence in the people she spoke to. Former professors, early investors, and people who met her during the founding years of Theranos have described the experience of listening to her pitch her vision as almost physically compelling. The kind of presence that makes you feel, while you are in the room with it, that the thing being described is not just possible but inevitable. She adopted what many observers later noted was a carefully constructed persona. The black turtleneck that drew immediate and obvious comparisons to Steve Jobs, the deliberately deepened voice that she maintained consistently in all professional settings, are the intense and unwavering eye contact that conveyed a sense of absolute focus and commitment. These were not accidental choices. They were the building blocks of a performance. And the performance worked, spectacularly and for a surprisingly long time, because the people it was designed to convince wanted very badly to believe in what she was describing. At its peak, Theranos was valued at $9 billion. Elizabeth Holmes appeared on the covers of Fortune, Forbes, and Time. She was celebrated as the world's youngest self-made female billionaire. She sat on prestigious boards, dined with heads of state, and was held up as a living proof that the barriers between ambition and achievement could be dissolved by sheer force of will. Meanwhile, according to the evidence presented at her federal trial, yet the technology at the center of all of it was not working the way she had told investors, partners, and patients it was working. The tests being run on the Theranos devices were, in many cases, producing results that were unreliable. Patients received medical information based on those results and made health decisions accordingly. The gap between the story Holmes was telling the world and the reality inside the laboratories of Theranos was, investigators and prosecutors alleged, not a gap born of honest mistakes or the ordinary struggles of an early-stage technology company trying to get a difficult product to market. It was, they argued, a deliberate and sustained deception. In January 2022, after a trial that drew intense public attention, Elizabeth Holmes was convicted on 4 counts of fraud. She was subsequently sentenced to more than 11 years in federal prison, a sentence that she appealed, and whose final resolution was still being processed through the legal system at the time of this recording. The $9 billion valuation was gone. The magazine covers were gone. The black turtleneck and the deepened voice and the unwavering eye contact, all of it had been insufficient in the end to hold the performance together against the weight of what the evidence showed. And the patients who had trusted their health to a technology that allegedly did not work as promised were left with something that no courtroom verdict and no prison sentence could fully address. What connects Ike Batista and Elizabeth Holmes beyond the obvious fact of their public collapses? Is something that behavioral economists and psychologists who study extreme wealth and ambition have identified as a pattern that appears with troubling consistency in the stories of people who perform success rather than simply pursue it. It is the tendency to become so invested in the story of what you are building that the story itself begins to take precedence over the building. The narrative becomes the product. The performance becomes the company. And at a certain point, the gap between the story and the reality becomes so wide that the only options available are to close it honestly, which means admitting publicly that things are not what you said they were, or to keep performing and hope that the reality eventually catches up to the story before anyone looks too closely. Most people, facing that choice, you find that the second option feels far less terrifying than the first. And most of the time, it is that choice, the choice to keep performing rather than to stop and tell the truth, that turns a difficult situation into a catastrophic one. It is a pattern that, once you learn to recognize it, you start to see everywhere, in business, in politics, in personal relationships, in the quiet stories of ordinary people who are not billionaires and never will be, but who understand, from their own experience, exactly what it feels like to be more committed to the appearance of success than to the reality of it. To understand why some of the wealthiest people in human history chose to live with almost nothing while others burned through fortunes at a speed that defied comprehension. And you have to be willing to look past the financial decisions themselves and ask a harder question. Not what did they do with their money, but why? Not what choices did they make, but what were those choices actually in service of? Because money, at the level we are talking about tonight, the level where the numbers become so large they lose practical meaning, where you could not spend it all if you tried, where the addition of another billion to the total changes nothing about your daily material reality. Money at that level stops being about money entirely. It becomes something else. It becomes a language in which people express the things they cannot or will not say out loud. Their fears, their wounds, their need for safety or significance or control or love or redemption. And if you want to understand why Warren Buffett clips coupons and Ike Batista bought a mansion with a gold-plated bathroom, you have to learn to read that language. You have to be willing to look at the money and ask, what is this really saying? Behavioral economists and psychologists who specialize in the financial behavior of ultra-high net worth individuals have identified a concept they refer to as the scarcity imprint. It is, in essence, the idea that a person's earliest and most formative experiences with money, the emotional texture of their financial childhood, the stories they heard and the scenes they witnessed and the fears they absorbed before they were old enough to consciously process any of it, create a template, a permanent emotional blueprint that shapes every financial decision they make for the rest of their life, yet regardless of how dramatically their material circumstances change. The scarcity imprint is not a conscious belief. It is not something a person can simply decide to override by reminding themselves that they now have more money than they could ever spend. It operates at a level below conscious thought, in the place where the nervous system stores its most fundamental convictions about what is safe and what is dangerous and what needs to be protected at all costs. And for the billionaires we have been examining tonight, the scarcity imprint explains almost everything. Warren Buffett absorbed his scarcity imprint during the Great Depression. He was born in 1930, the same year the American economy began its most catastrophic contraction in recorded history. By the time he was old enough to understand what was happening around him, he had already internalized the central lesson of that era, that financial security is not a permanent condition, that it can disappear fast, that the family who seems comfortable today can be devastated tomorrow, and that the only protection against that devastation is a relentless, almost obsessive commitment to not wasting what you have. This is not a lesson you learn in a classroom. This is a lesson you absorb through the air of a household where the adults are afraid, where the conversations at the dinner table have an edge of anxiety that a child cannot name but can absolutely feel. And that feeling, once it becomes part of who you are, does not leave when the circumstances change. It stays. It becomes the foundation on which every subsequent financial decision is built. Which is why Warren Buffett, sitting in his Omaha home with $130 billion in his financial portfolio, still experiences something close to discomfort at the thought of unnecessary spending. Not because he is irrational, but because the part of him that makes that call was formed long before rationality had anything to do with it. Ingvar Kamprad's scarcity imprint was forged in the rural austerity of Småland, Sweden, in the 1930s and 1940s. The culture of that region, historically and by reputation, prizes frugality not as a constraint, but as a virtue, as evidence of character, of seriousness, of respect for the resources that life provides. Kamprad grew up in a household and a community where waste was not just impractical but morally wrong, where the careful stewardship of what you had was understood as a form of integrity. And that moral dimension, the idea that how you treat money is a reflection of who you are as a person, never left him. When he flew economy class as a billionaire, he was not making a financial calculation. He was making a statement about his own character to himself more than to anyone else. He was confirming, in a daily and concrete way, that he was still the person he had always been. That the money had not changed him. That he had not betrayed the values of his childhood by becoming something he would have found unrecognizable at the age of 17. For Kamprad, the frugality was not a strategy. It was an identity. And identity, as any psychologist will tell you, is something people protect with extraordinary ferocity, often at significant cost to themselves in other areas of their lives. And now contrast that with the psychology that drove Ike Batista. Batista did not grow up poor. He did not absorb a scarcity imprint in the traditional sense. What he absorbed instead was something that behavioral psychologists sometimes call a significance deficit. The experience, common among the children of highly accomplished parents, of feeling that no matter what you achieve, it will always be measured against a standard that was set before you were old enough to compete. His father, Eliezer Batista, was, by any measure, a towering figure in Brazilian public and commercial life. Growing up in that shadow, according to people who knew Ike Batista during his formative years, created in him a hunger for recognition that was almost impossible to satisfy. One, because the recognition he needed was not just the acknowledgement that he had done well, it was the acknowledgement that he had done better, that he had surpassed the standard, that he was not just his father's son, but something larger and more extraordinary than his father's son. And that particular hunger, the hunger not just for success but for visible, undeniable, publicly confirmed superiority, is one of the most dangerous psychological forces that can be combined with access to significant capital. Because it means that no amount of money is ever enough, not because of greed in the conventional sense, but because the money is not actually what is being sought. What is being sought is something the money is supposed to symbolize. And when the symbol and the substance diverge, as they inevitably did in Batista's case, the consequences are catastrophic. Elizabeth Holmes presents a somewhat different psychological profile, one that researchers and journalists who have examined her story in depth have found genuinely difficult to reduce to a single explanatory framework. What seems clear, based on the extensive reporting done on her background and the testimony presented during her trial, is that Holmes from a very young age developed an extraordinarily powerful vision of who she was going to be and what she was going to achieve. She has spoken in interviews about the influence of her family's history of public service, about her early and intense desire to make a meaningful contribution to the world, about the specific dream of making medical testing more accessible and affordable for people who had historically been excluded from quality healthcare. And these were not cynical ambitions. They appeared to have been genuinely and deeply held. The complication, the place where the psychology becomes difficult and the story becomes dark, is in what happened when the technology refused to cooperate with the vision. Because for a person who has built their entire identity around a particular version of their own future, the moment when reality challenges that vision is not experienced as useful information. It is experienced as an existential threat. And the response to an existential threat is not careful recalibration and honest communication. The response to an existential threat is survival behavior. And survival behavior in a person of Holmes's intelligence and persuasive capability apparently took the form of continuing to project the vision with even greater confidence and conviction, even as the gap between the vision and the reality continued to widen. Now here is where the story becomes genuinely uncomfortable. Because what Buffett, Comprad, Batista, and Holmes all have in common, despite the extraordinary differences in how they express their relationship with money, is that none of them were making purely rational decisions. All of them, in ways large and small, were acting out of emotional imperatives that had been formed long before their wealth arrived. The scarcity imprint, the significance deficit, the identity protection, the existential commitment to a particular version of the future. These are not the decision-making frameworks of the purely rational economic actor that financial theory has traditionally assumed sits at the center of markets and businesses. See, they are the decision-making frameworks of human beings. Complicated, wounded, driven, fearful, hopeful, contradictory human beings who happen to have access to extraordinary amounts of capital. And that realization, the realization that the wealthiest and most powerful people in the world are, underneath everything, navigating the same basic emotional landscape as everyone else, is both deeply humanizing and, depending on your perspective, more than a little alarming. There is a man whose story sits at the intersection of all of these psychological threads, and whose choices represent perhaps the most radical response to the emotional complexities of extreme wealth that the modern era has produced. His name is Carl Rabeter. And Carl Rabeter's story begins not with childhood poverty or a powerful father or a revolutionary technology, but with a luxury vacation. In the early 2000s, Rabeter was a successful Austrian businessman who had built a profitable company selling high-end home accessories and interior design products. He was a millionaire several times over. He owned an alpine villa. He had a sailboat. He drove the cars and traveled to the destinations and lived the life that the culture around him had consistently told him represented the destination, the proof that the journey had been worth it. And then he went to Hawaii. He took a luxury vacation to Hawaii with his wife, the kind of vacation that people in his financial position take because they can, and because the culture of their world suggests that this is what success looks like when you finally let yourself enjoy it. And somewhere in the middle of that vacation, and something shifted in Carl Roboter in a way that he has since described as both sudden and, in retrospect, completely inevitable. He looked at the luxury surrounding him, the pristine resort, the carefully curated experience designed to make wealthy people feel that they were getting exactly what their money entitled them to. And he felt, not satisfaction, but a kind of hollow despair. Not because the vacation was unpleasant, but because it was completely disconnected from anything that felt real to him. He was performing the role of the successful man on the luxury vacation, and the performance felt like a prison. He returned to Austria and began the process of dismantling his life. He sold the Alpine villa. He sold the sailboat. He sold the cars. He sold the business. He moved into a small wooden cabin, and he took the proceeds of everything he had sold and donated them to microfinance projects in Latin America, specifically focused on supporting small entrepreneurs in some of the poorest communities in Central and South America. When journalists found him and asked him why, he was remarkably consistent and remarkably clear in his answer. He said that the more he had accumulated, the more isolated he had felt from genuine human connection. That the wealth had not brought him closer to the life he actually wanted, but had instead built an increasingly elaborate barrier between him and it. That the cabin was not a punishment or a deprivation. It was, for the first time in his adult life, a home that actually felt like the place where he lived, rather than a statement about what he had achieved. A Carl Roboter is not a billionaire in the conventional sense. His wealth, at its peak, placed him firmly in the millionaire category rather than the 10-figure category occupied by Buffett and Feeney and Camprad. But his story belongs in this conversation precisely because it strips away the complexity of the extreme numbers and reveals the emotional core of what we have been circling throughout this entire video. The question of what money is actually for. And the deeply personal, deeply human answer that each of the people in this story arrived at, even if the paths they took to get there looked nothing like each other. Because here is what the research, the reporting, and the raw human stories we have been examining tonight all point toward. The relationship between wealth and happiness is not a straight line. It is not the case that more money produces more happiness in a simple and continuous way. What the evidence suggests, and what the lives of the people in this video illustrate with almost documentary precision, is that money amplifies. It takes whatever is already present in a person's emotional architecture, the fears, the wounds, the values, the hungers, the convictions, and it makes those things larger and more powerful and harder to ignore. For Warren Buffett, it amplified a deeply held conviction about the value of patience and the danger of waste. And the result was one of the most successful and quietly admirable lives in the history of American capitalism. For Ike Batista, it amplified a hunger for significance that could never be fully satisfied, and the result was a spectacular ascent followed by an equally spectacular collapse. For Carl Roboter, it amplified a growing awareness that the life he was living was not the life he actually wanted, and the result was a radical act of voluntary simplicity that the people around him mostly could not understand, but that he has consistently described as the best decision he ever made. Money did not create any of these outcomes. The seeds were already there, planted long before the money arrived. The money just gave them more room to grow. In 1984, a man sitting in a lawyer's office in the Bahamas signed a document that transferred his entire fortune, every asset, every dollar, every financial instrument attached to his name, to a private charitable foundation. He was worth, at the time of that signing, approximately $8 billion. He signed the document quietly, without ceremony, without a press release, without any of the apparatus of public announcement that normally accompanies a financial event of that magnitude. He told the lawyers to keep it confidential. He told the handful of trusted associates who knew what he had done to say nothing. And then he went back to his life. He flew economy class. He stayed in modest hotels. He ate in ordinary restaurants. He wore a $15 Casio watch on his wrist and carried his documents in a plastic shopping bag rather than a leather briefcase. And for more than a decade, The world had absolutely no idea that Chuck Feeney had just given away one of the largest personal fortunes in American history. Charles Francis Feeney was born in 1931 in Elizabeth, New Jersey, to an Irish-American working-class family. His father was an insurance underwriter. His mother was a nurse. The family was not poor, but they were not wealthy, and the values of careful management and genuine appreciation for what you had were present in his upbringing in a way that, like Buffett and Camprad, never entirely left him. He served in the United States Air Force during the Korean War, and it was during his military service in Japan that he first identified the business opportunity that would eventually make him a billionaire. He noticed that American military personnel had money to spend and limited access to consumer goods, and he began selling duty-free goods, initially liquor and tobacco, to American sailors and military staff in Asian ports. This was the seed of what would eventually become Duty-Free Shoppers, the global retail company that Feeney co-founded with a business partner named Robert Miller in 1960, and that grew over the following decades into one of the most profitable duty-free retail operations in the world, with stores in airports and other travel hubs across Asia, Europe, and the Americas. By the 1980s, Feeney was extraordinarily wealthy, and it was precisely at the moment of his greatest financial success that he made the decision that would define everything that followed. The philosophical foundation for that decision had been building for years. Feeney had read Andrew Carnegie's famous 1889 essay known as The Gospel of Wealth, in which Carnegie argued that a man who dies rich dies disgraced, that the accumulation of great wealth carries with it a moral obligation to deploy that wealth in service of the broader community rather than simply passing it to one's heirs. Carnegie's argument resonated with Feeney at a deep level, connecting with values about service and responsibility that had been part of his upbringing, and that the accumulation of wealth had never displaced. But Feeney went further than Carnegie in one crucial respect. Carnegie had given generously during his lifetime but had also left a substantial estate at his death. Feeney decided that was not enough. He decided that if the giving was worth doing, it was worth doing completely. He would not give what was comfortable or what was convenient. He would give everything. And he would do it while he was still alive so that he could see the impact, guide the process, and ensure that the money was being used in the ways he believed would be most effective. He called the philosophy giving while living, and he pursued it with the same methodical, patient, detail-oriented discipline that he had brought to building his business empire in the first place. The foundation through which Feeney channeled his giving was called Atlantic Philanthropies, and it operated for decades with a level of confidentiality that was, in the world of major philanthropy, essentially unprecedented. Most large foundations are public entities by design. Their donors want the recognition. They want the buildings named after them, the honorary degrees, the place at the table of public life that significant charitable giving traditionally purchases. Feeney wanted none of that. He insisted on anonymity. He instructed Atlantic Philanthropy's staff not to reveal the source of their grants. He declined interviews, avoided public appearances, and lived in a way that made it essentially impossible for anyone who encountered him casually to guess that they were in the presence of one of the most significant philanthropists in American history. The journalist who first broke the story of Feeney's secret giving, Connor O'Cleary, has described the experience of tracking down the details as one of the most surprising investigative journeys of his career. Not because the information was hidden behind elaborate legal structures, but because the man at the center of it was so genuinely, completely, and apparently effortlessly uninterested in recognition that the absence of any public trail was not strategic so much as it was a natural consequence of who he actually was. Over the course of approximately 35 years, Atlantic Philanthropies distributed approximately $8 billion across a range of causes and geographies that reflected Feeney's particular convictions about where money could do the most good. He funded universities on both sides of the Atlantic, contributing hundreds of millions of dollars to institutions in Ireland, Northern Ireland, Australia, Vietnam, South Africa, and the United States. He was a significant financial supporter of the peace process in Northern Ireland during the 1990s, a cause that connected to his Irish heritage and his belief that the conflict there represented both a profound human tragedy and a situation where targeted intervention could genuinely change the trajectory of events. He funded cancer research centers, community health programs, and initiatives focused on aging and end-of-life care. He gave to Cornell University, his alma mater, on a scale that transformed the institution's capacity in multiple academic areas. And he did all of it, consistently and without exception, without putting his name on anything. There are buildings around the world that exist because of Chuck Feeney's money, and that bear the names of other donors, because Feeney declined the naming rights and suggested they go to someone else. In 2020, at the age of 89, our Chuck Feeney sat in a modest apartment in San Francisco, rented, not owned, and signed the final documents confirming that Atlantic Philanthropies had distributed its last dollar. The mission was complete. The foundation, which had been established with the explicit intention of spending itself out of existence rather than operating in perpetuity as most large foundations do, had done exactly what Feeney had designed it to do. $8 billion had been given away. Nothing remained. And in the photographs taken that day, Feeney is smiling. Not the performed smile of a man who understands that a camera is present and that smiling is what the moment calls for. A genuine smile. The smile of a man who has finished something that he set out to do and who finds that the finishing feels exactly the way he hoped it would. He kept, for his own retirement, approximately $2 million. In a world where billionaires measure their personal expenditures in tens of millions annually, $2 million for retirement is, by any measure, an act of almost radical restraint. He and his wife lived quietly in the rented San Francisco apartment, surrounded not by the artifacts of accumulated wealth, but by the knowledge of what the wealth had become in the hands of the causes and communities and institutions it had flowed through. Chuck Feeney passed away on October 9th, 2023, at the age of 92. He left behind no fortune. He left behind no empire in the conventional sense. What he left behind was a model, a demonstration conducted at extraordinary scale over the course of a remarkable life, that it is possible to have everything and to choose, deliberately and joyfully to let it go, and that the letting go, far from being a loss, can be the most profoundly satisfying thing a person ever does. But here is the part of Chuck Feeney's story that I have been turning over in my mind since I first encountered it, and that I want to leave with you as we move into the final chapter of this video. Feeney's giving was not a response to guilt. It was not a late-life reckoning with the ethical implications of having accumulated more than any individual could ever need. It was something he decided before the money had fully arrived, before he was old enough to have spent decades living inside the identity of an ultra-wealthy person and then making the difficult psychological journey of separating himself from that identity. He made the decision early, held to it consistently, and pursued it with a patience and a discipline and a genuine absence of ego that most people, if they are honest with themselves, would find almost impossible to sustain. Because giving money away anonymously, at that scale, over that period of time, without ever allowing the giving to become part of your public identity or your personal narrative or the story you tell about who you are, that requires a relationship with the self that is genuinely extraordinary. It requires knowing, in a deep and settled and completely unperformative way, that who you are has nothing to do with what you have. And that, more than the $8 billion, more than the decades of anonymous generosity, or more than any specific hospital or university or peace negotiation that his money helped to make possible. That is the thing about Chuck Feeney that I find most remarkable and most challenging. We started this video with a single line on a black screen. He has $130 billion in his bank account. This morning, he clipped coupons. And I told you then that by the end of this hour, you would not just see billionaires differently. You would see money itself differently. We have traveled a long way since that opening. We have been inside the Depression-era childhood that shaped Warren Buffett's unshakable conviction that waste is a form of moral failure. We have sat with Ingvar Kamprad at his Swedish flea market, arguing cheerfully over the price of a tomato while running one of the most successful retail empires in modern history. We have watched Ike Batista spread his arms wide on the deck of a luxury yacht, declaring himself the future richest person on Earth, and then watched, with something close to vertigo, as $34 billion disappeared in 18 months. We have followed Elizabeth Holmes through the rise and fall of a performance so sustained and so convincing that it fooled some of the most sophisticated investors and advisors in the world. We have sat with Karl Roboter in his Austrian cabin and tried to understand what it feels like to look at a life full of everything the world told you to want and feel nothing but the desire to give it all back. And we have walked alongside Chuck Feeney through 35 years of quiet, our anonymous, extraordinary generosity, and tried to imagine what it must feel like to sign the final document and know that $8 billion has been transformed, molecule by molecule, into hospitals and universities and peace agreements and human lives made materially better. Now it is time to step back, to look at all of these stories together, and to ask the question that every single one of them, in their own way, has been building toward. What is money actually for? Not in the abstract macroeconomic sense, not in the sense that a textbook would answer the question, but in the lived, personal, utterly human sense that the stories in this video have been pressing on all along. What is it for? Because here is what I keep coming back to. After spending weeks inside the research and the reporting and the raw human details of these lives. Not one of the people we have examined tonight found what they were looking for inside the money itself. Not one of them. Warren Buffett, who has spent a lifetime accumulating one of the greatest fortunes in human history, has said repeatedly and in various ways that the accumulation itself was never the point. The point was the game, the intellectual challenge of finding value where others had missed it. The satisfaction of being right, over and over again, over the long arc of decades. The money was the scorecard, not the prize. Ingvar Kamprad found his meaning not in what the money could buy, but in what the business could build. The democratic design philosophy that said, beautiful, functional objects should not be the exclusive province of people who could afford to pay for handmade craftsmanship, and that ordinary people deserved to live in homes that reflected care and thoughtfulness and aesthetic intention. The money was the measure of how well the mission was being executed, not the mission itself. Ika Batista was looking for something the money genuinely cannot provide. The permanent, unconditional acknowledgement that he was exceptional in his own right, independent of his father's legacy. No amount of money could give him that, because the need did not originate in a place that money can reach. It originated in the emotional experience of a child measuring himself against a standard that felt always slightly beyond his grasp, and deciding that the only response was to reach further and harder and more visibly than anyone around him. The money amplified that reaching. It gave it scale and velocity and public visibility. But it never addressed the underlying wound. And when the money collapsed, the wound was still there, exactly where it had always been, now simply exposed to the full and unforgiving attention of the world. Elizabeth Holmes was looking for the validation of a vision, the confirmation that what she could see so clearly in her imagination was real, was achievable, was going to change the course of medical history in the way she had always believed it would. The tragedy of her story is not simply that she was convicted of fraud. The tragedy is that the gap between the vision and the reality, had it been handled differently and more honestly, it might have produced a very different outcome. The technology she was pursuing was genuinely difficult. The problems she was trying to solve were genuinely significant. But the commitment to the performance of success, rather than the patient and transparent pursuit of it, turned what might have been a difficult chapter in the story of an ambitious company into the defining fact of an entire life. Karl Roboter was looking for connection, for the feeling of being genuinely present in his own life rather than performing the role that his financial success had assigned him. And when he found that the simplest path to that connection was to remove the elaborate structure of wealth that had grown up between him and it, he took that path without hesitation, regardless of how strange it looked to the people around him. And Chuck Feeney was looking for meaning, for the experience of having his time on Earth add up to something that mattered in a way that he could feel clearly and directly, without the intermediary of financial valuation or market capitalization or public recognition. He found it in giving, not in the recognition that giving sometimes produces, but in the act itself. In the direct, unmediated experience of resources flowing from his hands into the hands of people and institutions that could use them to make something real and lasting and genuinely good. And now, here we are, at the end of this story. And I want to do something that documentary films and YouTube videos do not always do. I want to be honest with you about what I think this story means, not for billionaires, for all of us. Y'all, for the 35-year-old watching this on a Tuesday evening, wondering whether the financial decisions they are making right now are going to lead somewhere worth going. For the 50-year-old who has worked hard for 20 years and accumulated something real and is starting to ask whether the accumulation is actually making them happier. For the 60-year-old who is beginning the process of looking back at a life and trying to assess what the choices added up to. Here is what I think the billionaires in this video have to tell us, if we are willing to actually listen. The scarcity imprint that shaped Warren Buffett, the deep, pre-rational conviction that security can disappear and must be protected, is not unique to people who lived through the Great Depression. It lives in most of us, in varying degrees of intensity, formed by the financial textures of our own childhoods, our own families, our own earliest experiences of money as something that was either present or absent, and that its presence or absence changed everything. And like Buffett, most of us carry that imprint into our adult financial lives without ever fully examining it. Without ever asking whether the choices we are making about money are actually in service of what we want our lives to be, or whether they are in service of an emotional blueprint that was formed before we had the tools to question it. The significance deficit that drove Ike Batista, the hunger for external validation as a substitute for a more settled and internal sense of self-worth, is not, as I hope this video has made clear, a pathology unique to the children of powerful parents. It is, in some form, present in almost every human being who has ever felt unseen or underestimated or measured against a standard they were not sure they could meet. The difference between Batista and most of the rest of us is simply that he had $34 billion with which to pursue the validation he was seeking. The underlying hunger was recognizable, painfully, uncomfortably recognizable. And Chuck Feeney's giving while living, the radical act of treating wealth as a temporary custodianship rather than a permanent personal attribute, does not require $8 billion to be meaningful as a philosophy. It requires only the willingness to ask, seriously and honestly, what the money is actually in service of, what the work is actually for, what the accumulation is pointing toward, and whether the direction it is pointing is one that, at the end of everything, you will feel was worth traveling. Warren Buffett, who at the time of this recording is in his 90s and still living in his Omaha house, still eating his McDonald's breakfast, still reading and thinking and playing bridge online, has said something in various interviews over the years that I have been thinking about since long before I started working on this video. He has said that he considers himself to have won the ovarian lottery, that he was born in the right place at the right time, with the right combination of temperament and circumstance that allowed the particular skills he happened to have to become extraordinarily valuable in the particular economy in which he found himself. And that recognition, that the fortune was not entirely, or perhaps even primarily, the result of his own exceptional qualities, but also of circumstances he did not choose and could not have manufactured, has informed his giving and his philosophy and his life in ways that are, when you sit with them, genuinely moving. Ike Batista, according to reports at the time of this recording, is still engaged in the legal proceedings that have followed his financial collapse, still attempting in various ways to rebuild something from the wreckage, still, by many accounts, not entirely at peace with what happened and what it means. Elizabeth Holmes began serving her federal prison sentence, and the final resolution of her appeals and the full arc of her legal situation were still unfolding as this video was being prepared. Ingvar Kamprad's IKEA continues to operate in the spirit of the values he built it around. The democratic design philosophy and the suspicion of unnecessary expense that he held from his childhood in Smoland until the last day of his life. Carl Roboter continues, as far as available reporting indicates, to live simply and to work with the microfinance organizations he has supported, and to describe his life as one that finally feels genuinely his own. And Chuck Feeney is gone, but the hospitals are there, and the universities are there, and the peace, fragile and hard-won and still requiring constant tending, is there in Northern Ireland. And somewhere in San Francisco, in the rented apartment where he spent his final years, there is the echo of a man who had everything and chose to become someone for whom having everything meant giving everything, and who found, in that choice, exactly what he had been looking for all along. So I will leave you with the question that I think this entire video has been building toward. Not about billionaires, about you. About the choices you are making right now, with whatever version of wealth or scarcity or sufficiency you are currently navigating. What is the money for? What is the work for? What are the choices you are making in service of? And when you get to the end of your own story, whenever that is, and however it unfolds, what do you want the answer to have been? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely want to know what this video stirred up for you, because that conversation, the one that happens in the comments after a story like this one, is, in my experience, often more interesting and more honest than anything I could have put in the video itself. And I will be there, reading every single one,